Welcome back to Mean Streets, where each week we investigate the best, worst, and forgotten movies of film noir. I'm Luke Deckard.
And I'm Matthew Booth.
And today we're saying Happy Bloody New Year. It's 2025, apparently.
And Happy New Year to everyone listening.
Yes, we hope you enjoyed last week's episode where we're talking about our some of our favorite film noirs. Hope you got a chance to watch some of those if you haven't already. This week, because it's another sort of laid back week, we decided to do something again a little bit different. This week we are going to talk about our 5 favorite TV detective stroke PIs stroke amateur sleuths. I think I'm quite excited about these 5 to give them a mention. I think some listeners will certainly know them at least, and if not, hopefully we'll be able to send people down a rabbit trail to find some new stuff. But yeah, did you have any struggles picking your 5, Matt?
No, not really. These are long-standing ones.
Yeah,
they're not necessarily all detectives that were created for TV, which might be a clue as to who my number 1 is. But they are people who have got a strong, or have had, or still have a strong TV presence.
Fair enough. Well, let's dive in. So I'll go first with my number 5. So with my number 5, it's a duo, and it might be a little bit out there, but I chose Mulder and Scully from the X-Files.
Not a bad choice. They are detectives after all.
They are. See, I love the X-Files. The X-Files ran from 1993 to 2002, had 2 films, and then 2 extra seasons, one in 2016 and one in 2018. So it's run a very long time. And last year into this year, me and my wife, we watched the whole shebang, and my God, do I love this show. I love it. Even when it's a bit rough during the Mulderless years, it's still fantastic. But it's one of those shows that gets so over talked about because of its connection to the spooky and the paranormal and the aliens, that a lot of people don't see it as. It's also very, very noir. I mean, I love that Mulder is stuck in the basement working in the gutter of the FBI. Like, that is what PIs do. They work in the gutter. Mulder's working in the gutter. And Scully is the femme fatale. She's set up to be the femme fatale. She's there to undermine and prove him wrong and get him defunct, basically. Obviously it doesn't happen, but that's the setup, and it's so wonderful. It's basically the Glass Key, but with aliens.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
It's wonderful.
Yeah, I don't think I ever would have thought about that until you've just said it. But yeah, it is. Yeah. It is the Glass Key with aliens, and I agree about she is there to debunk him, and she is there to be a spanner in his works and stuff. But I mean, it's a long time since I watched the X-Files. When it first came out, it was university or whenever it was, and what I enjoyed about it was that relationship developed and became the not typical, but the sort of prototype and archetype of the odd couple detective duo.
Mm-hmm.
They are, in many ways, a play and a sort of distorted view of that initial idea of
definitely
the genius detective and the more straightforward thinking sidekick.
Yeah, there's a peppering of Holmes and Watson going on for sure.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting to, really. Yeah, and that is, but it's done in a different. It's done in its own way. Which shows how much mileage there is in that formula. And I agree that it is very noirish. It is very noirish, the way it's all set up, and the way that relationship becomes, where they become friends. There isn't any of that. Or I don't remember there being any of that. Will they? Won't they?
There was a lot of that.
Oh, was there?
You are definitely forgetting a lot.
I must have stopped watching. Well, I did stop watching it after a while, so maybe it all happened after I stopped watching it.
Okay.
Oh, I can't be doing with any of that.
Yeah. Oh, I actually really like their relationship. I love the romance that builds between these two because it's just not played out in a typical way. Like it's incredibly restrained, and they've clearly been intimate, but they've been together so long that they're basically an old married couple. They don't bicker, like, it's not like played for gags, but there is just they have a very interesting relationship that neither one of them, I think could ever be with anyone else in the real world because of all the stuff that they've experienced together.
Yeah, I can buy that. Yeah, I can
when people say like that's their person, I feel like that they know that, but they just always struggle to make it work, and that was kind of recurring from about season like 5 onwards. Is will they, won't they, kind of thing.
I suppose it's a bit like when Lois Lane says to Superman in Superman 2, you're a tough act to follow.
Yeah, yes, pretty much.
Pretty much. What would a bloke who Dana Scully dates what's he got to compare when Mulder's seen aliens and people who can turn themselves into whatever it is?
Yes.
Like, talk about baseball is not going to go much for. Not going to go very far, is it?
Oh, exactly. But that's my
a good choice.
5 pick.
Yeah, that's a good choice.
What's your number 5?
My number 5 is a little bit out there. And my number 5 is Dale Cooper.
Who? I don't even know who that is.
He's the FBI agent in Twin Peaks, played by Kyle MacLachlan.
Of course.
I say he's played by Kyle MacLachlan, and he can only be played by Kyle MacLachlan. That fella has a quality which is absolutely perfect for Dale Cooper, because Dale Cooper starts off as this FBI agent, again, very Holmesian. And he goes to this small town on the Canadian border called Twin Peaks and finds himself investigating the murder of a high school prom queen, Laura Palmer. And as it goes on, he finds himself involved in increasingly bizarre things because this is David Lynch behind the camera.
Exactly.
So it's fair to say that Dale Cooper goes on a pretty wild journey, which for 25 years was left unresolved. And then Lynch brought it back and made possibly the best TV series I've ever seen, but also the most bizarre. But what's great about Dale Cooper is his absolute childlike innocence. Mm-hmm. He arrives wide-eyed. He's dictating a note to his secretary while he's driving into Twin Peaks, and he says, he summarizes the information he's got in a very professional way. And then he looks around him and he says, I have never seen so many trees. I have got to find out what these trees are. They are amazing. And then he checks into this hotel. The next time you see him, he's ordering breakfast, and he gives an absolutely minute, detailed explanation of how he wants it cooked. And he's dead enthusiastic about it. He can't wait. And he's always sticking his thumb up in approval at something someone said, and he lives for cherry pie and coffee. And gradually that childlike innocence sort of ebbs away as the series events start to take the toll on him. And throughout the 3 series of Twin Peaks, he goes from that innocent enthusiasm through to corruption into heroism with a very noir ending. Twin Peaks is very noir. And I love him. When he returned in the 3rd series a few years ago, I can't tell you how many goosebumps rose on my flesh when he stated that he was back. I won't say too much about how he comes back. It's too complicated for a start. But yeah, Dale Cooper, I think he's an absolutely brilliant creation. And
fantastic.
He's played to perfection by Kyle MacLachlan in what I still consider the best TV series of all time.
That's a good one. I'm curious if we will have any clashes, and I think this might be the only one. My 4 might be the only one that we might have a clash with, but we'll see. 4 for me is Endeavor Morse from Endeavor.
Well, my number 2 is Inspector Morse to include Endeavor.
Okay. Okay, so
So do you want to get into him now?
Yeah, let's just tackle Endeavor now. So I specifically chose Endeavor, which is the prequel series to the old 80s ITV show Inspector Morse. His name is Inspector Endeavor Morse. The old show was called Morse. The prequel's called Endeavor. Clever. Ha ha ha. I loved Endeavor. It ran from 2012 to 2023. Had 9 seasons. I thought Sean Evans, who plays young Morse, is just what a powerhouse actor he is. I love the way this show establishes all of these things that are going to come to be staples of Morse's character as an adult, as we see later, like the alcoholism, the arrogance that he has because he's so smart and he's struggling to deal with people who aren't as smart as him, and he thinks
Absolutely.
he just thinks because he's so smart people just need to shut up and listen to him, but he also needs to learn humility and also that inability to maintain a romantic relationship. I mean, he is very noir. He's one of the British crime fiction protagonists who definitely has more shades of noir than I think he does golden age shades, for me at least.
I would agree with that. If you took an Endeavor, I would agree with that.
Endeavor, yes. But I also love that it's also set in 1960s Oxford, and I think what a fantastic setting, because Oxford is ageless because it's so old anyway. And they filmed on location there, and it's beautiful and wonderful to go there and look at. But it's also a little bit Get Carter at times. His Fred Thursday is, with his gangster connections and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of gangster involvement throughout the series and bent cops, and it definitely is.
And the Masons, the Freemasons,
the Mason, and that's one of the nods to the Morse series, because there was a famous episode where he comes up against the Masons, and that's what I like about it. It's very clever. It sets up some of the things that are going to happen in Inspector Morse, but it manages to remain its own thing.
Yes.
You could watch it and never watch an episode of Morse and not lose out.
Yes. Unlike shows like Star Trek Discovery and stuff like that are so heavy laden with member berries and things that if you don't know the things that they're trying to show you don't know what the F is going on. So much respect for Morse, for Endeavor.
So one of my favorite examples of that, because there are loads of them. There are loads of them in almost every episode.
Yeah.
All written by the same man, Russell Lewis, which
genius, man.
Is a real sort of testament to creativity.
Yes.
And in the pilot episode, somebody said the first thing you see is a bus going to Woodstock, and it's dawn. And somebody says he was waiting for the first bus to Woodstock, and the very first Morse novel is called Last Bus to Woodstock.
Yeah.
Now you're either going to get that or you're not, and if you're a geek like me, you get it. And there's all sorts of things that are thrown in, almost casually tossed in, that are an absolute. That's what Easter eggs should be. They shouldn't be signposted. They should just happen, and you almost don't notice them, And Endeavor is a fabulous series. I was a big fan of Morse. Which is a much more golden agey. Some of the episodes are very dark. That's not to say that that they're all cozy, but it was much more golden agey than Endeavor is. And I would say at a push, I prefer Endeavor to Morse now, to the Morse series now.
Yeah.
What I've always liked about the Morse series is the juxtaposition between his cultured and sensitive side and the blackness that he has to deal with, but that's much more obvious in Endeavor than it is in Morse.
Yeah,
there's that brilliant bit where Thursday is a great creation. There's a bit where Thursday says, "Go home, put your favorite record on as loud as it'll go, and remember, it's one thing they can't take away from you."
Yeah,
that is, goosebumps even saying it now. Brilliant series. That was my number 2.
That the big fans. If you've not seen Endeavor or Morse, they're well worth your time. Well worth your time. Some of the best of British detective fiction, I would say.
Yeah,
it doesn't get hokey. Everyone's watching that new show Ludwig, which is just with David Mitchell. That is just crap. Endeavor's where it's at. So,
but you do have to watch Endeavor in order, I would suggest.
Yeah, I would. Yes. Yeah, I would. So my number 3 is Dexter Morgan from the TV show Dexter.
Ooh, nice one.
Yes, I love the show Dexter. So Dexter ran from 2006 to 2013, starred a hell of a cast. Michael C. Hall as Dexter Morgan. Julia Benz as Rita, Jennifer Carpenter as Deborah Morgan, Eric King as the infamous Dokes. I can't cuss, or I would use one of Dokes' famous mother effer lines, but we try not to do that on this podcast.
Try not to do
that. Based on the books by Jeff Lindsay. I think Dexter had, as a character, I think he's just so fantastic, and I think Michael C. Hall brings that character to life perfectly. I almost wish that he did the audiobooks. I don't know. I don't think he does, but I want to hear his voice do the audiobooks, because it's one of those things where, like, anytime like there's an event happening, and a bit kind of like what I do with Blade Runner, when when people say I see things, I go into the speech from Roy. Anytime it's like something is happening tonight, I'm always like, the first line of the very first episode of Dexter is "Tonight's the night," and also like pork sandwiches, my favorite. I don't know. There's just something about his delivery that just sticks in my brain. But I think as a character, he's fantastic. He's scary because he's a serial killer, but he's also got this weird kind of this bizarre bent code, and it's almost like, did he even need to be a serial killer? Did his dad push him into doing this? Could his dad have, his adopted dad, have done something different to not like foster this? Like, what is wrong with his dad to have done this to him?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, there's stuff like that that's so fun and complicated to sink into. So I just absolutely adore this show. I think it had 4 really strong seasons, and then had 4 kind of so-so seasons, but I will say I absolutely adore the sequel series, Dexter New Blood. I thought it was fantastic. I thought that was a really good way to bring everything back, and for the moment, it was an attempt to close out the series. However, 2025 is bringing us 2 more Dexter series, a prequel series, which is odd because it's sort of like literally right before Dexter, and then they're doing another Dexter show with Michael C. Hall. But if you've seen Dexter New Blood, there's some complications with that. So I have speculation as to how it's going to happen, and maybe how these 2 shows feed into each other, but
time will tell.
And it's one of those things where it's like, I normally complain when they kind of milk a franchise, but Michael C. Hall is so great that I'm like, I could see him, just let him be Dexter forever. I want to see more of him as Dexter, just because he's so good.
Yeah. I can buy that. I've not seen Dexter all the way through. I've watched a few series and did enjoy it. It's just, I think life took over,
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's something I'll have to revisit.
It's also one of those shows where like people always like bitch about how like there's no representation. This show is fantastic with representation, but it does it in an honest way, and that like they tackled tough situations of women working in predominantly kind of masculine environments or roles, but also like cattiness. Like LaGuerta is also being very bitchy towards Deborah, and very sort of cutthroat and stuff. And it's just a very complicated world, and I like the way that they address social issues in this show. It takes it seriously and doesn't play it for like, look, pat on the back kind of stuff. So I really appreciate it for that as well. It's one of my favorites.
Excellent.
But yeah, that's my number 3. What's your number 3?
Well, I think I need to do my number 4.
Oh, right. Wait. Oh, it's because of
because Moore's got in the way.
Because I skipped over that because of duh.
So my number 4. Anyway, very quickly. My number 4 is a character called Sagan Aren from a Swedish TV series called The Bridge.
Okay.
Do you know The Bridge?
No.
So here's the setup for The Bridge. There's a massive bridge that connects Sweden and Denmark.
Mm.
On the middle of it, right on what would essentially be the border, if there was one, right on the middle of this bridge is a body. And Sagan Aren is Swedish detective, and there's a Denmark equivalent called Martin Roeder. And they're sort of arguing about who should take control of this case. And in the end, they say, well, let's sort it out when we've moved the body. When they move the body, it's cut in half. When they get it to the mortuary, the legs don't belong to the torso. So the legs are a murder victim in Denmark, and the torso is a murder victim in Sweden. And they have to work together. And again, we get the odd couple, because Martin Roeder is a very compassionate, friendly family man. But Sagan Aren is, I'm not sure it ever says what she is, but I'm going to say autistic.
Mm.
She has absolutely no filter. She has no human sort of connection. You know, she will, if she needs some information, she will just ask you for it. You know, no matter how sort of offensive it might be, or however sort of ill-timed it might be. So she starts to question when they find out who the dead woman is on the Swedish side. She starts interrogating the family like straight away, and it's down to Martin to say, "Not now," sort of thing. And she goes on this journey. The character goes on this journey to sort of humanize herself.
Oh, interesting.
Under Martin's influence, a bit, you know, a sort of a cheesy way of encapsulating what happens is it's the Terminator and John Connor in Terminator 2.
Okay, yeah.
And at the end, all that after it's like 10 episodes, 12 episodes, whatever it is, that is paid off in a magnificent way. So it's a great series anyway. It is very noir. It's very dark, but it is a whodunit at its heart, but it's very dark. And she stands head and shoulders above everybody else in it, all the other characters in it. It's a brilliant performance by an actress called Sophia Helene. And she is absolutely spellbinding. And there's about 4 series, I think, of The Bridge. And at the end of the 4th series, Sagan Aren does something which really makes you want to stand up and cheer. If you followed her through her whole journey. And she goes through the mill. You know, she goes through the mill. And she's just so, for someone who is so sort of alienated from society because of her condition, she is so likable. And she's so admirable. And she's so well presented. If you've not seen The Bridge, there were a load of copies. So we had England and France and the bodies found in the Channel Tunnel. We had America and Mexico and it's found on the border. We had Germany and Austria or something, you know, whatever it was. There was loads of copies. But the original was the Swedish-Denmark series, and it's absolutely brilliant.
There we go. I'll have to check that out. That sounds fantastic.
And if you don't fall in, I recommended it to somebody a couple of months ago, and I said, if you don't fall in love with Sagan Aren, then there's something wrong with you.
So that was your number 4.
That was my number 4.
What's your number 3 to catch us up?
My number 3 isn't necessarily, there are noir elements, but it's more classic British crime. And it's Commander Adam Dalgleish.
I know this name.
He's the P.D. James character. I'm a big admirer of P.D. James. And in the 80s? There were a series of 80s and 90s. There were a series of adaptations with Roy Marsden, which were compulsive viewing. So I would have been just getting into my crime fiction foray, you know. And a bit like Morse, Dalgleish is a cultured, sensitive, compassionate man, but he has to deal with real violent death, you know, and they are sometimes bizarre, violent deaths.
Yeah.
And he has to wade through it all. And he's absolutely, he's compassionate, but absolutely dedicated to getting to the truth. And he's a poet as well as a detective, which he keeps getting like ribbed for, because they say, how can a poet possibly understand catching criminals and vice versa? But there's been a recent series with Bertie Carvel, which heavily truncate the books, but he brings a real sadness and darkness to the character that Roy Marsden didn't always do for me. And that's satisfying more enlightened audiences, I suppose, audiences that want a bit more than just a detective series. But it's all there in the books. You know, it is all there in the books. They're very much detective stories rather than crime novels, and I think there's a subtle difference between the two. But she populates them with real people, and they come across on the TV versions as well. So Dalglish, I think, is a fascinating character. He's very reserved. He's got a tragic backstory involving his wife and child, and he's very reserved. And he refuses to let anybody get, close to him because he's been hurt by it all. But he's also so compassionate and understanding of other people's feelings that he is able to get into them.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a juxtaposition going on there, and a bit of a contrast between his character and what's going on in his head. And he comes across well. He isn't, and the books aren't the classic golden age detective stories, in the sense that Adam Dalglish is not Miss Marple, and Adam Dalglish is not Hercule Poirot, who are just a collection of mannerisms and catchphrases. If arguably, he's much more complex than that, and much darker than that. So he's my number 3.
That sounds good. As one I don't know, I've never watched this. I've never watched that. PD James is a blank spot for me. That I'll have to check this stuff out. My number 2, coming to the home stretch here. My number 2 is Thomas Magnum.
I knew he was gonna come.
Oh, I love Magnum so much. My God, this show is fantastic. So
I've not done this podcast with you for so long without knowing that Thomas Magnum wasn't going to crop up.
Oh, he's got to. He's got to. One day we'll do an episode of Magnum for the show. Yeah. So this show ran for 8 seasons from 1980 to 1988. It's one of those shows that even though it's set in the 80s, it still very much feels like it's the 70s. I don't know if that's because it's Hawaii and it's the beach and that kind of stuff, but like certain characters like Larry Mantini's Rick, he just always dresses like he's straight from the disco, like every every scene. and Roger
always
Emosley's
got tight white trousers on.
Yeah, it's not. It's like every time, like, all right, well, because it's weird. Because then I'll watch other shows from the '80s that maybe like a little bit later, and you get an '80s vibe. But for some reason with Magnum, you just get a firm, like it's still hanging on to the '70s. There, it's fantastic. But the thing is, I think when people think about Magnum, they think of like the pop culture idea of Magnum, which is very similar to I think the pop culture idea of Captain Kirk, which isn't the character. I feel like people think of Magnum as like action guy who's always getting the girls, who has the mustache and drives the car. But when you dive into it, he's actually dirt poor, and he's quite boyish in that he is making chili dogs, watching baseball games, things like that. Yes, he is chasing women. But the show like peels the layers back a bit, and you actually learn that a lot of this sort of boyishness is, in my opinion, masking some of the horrors that he has experienced in Vietnam. And it's his way of coping is essentially just trying to be a bit more lighthearted. And so therefore I find him to be a much more complicated character than I realized when I was a kid. When because my aunt used to watch the show all the time. And I would watch it with her every once in a while. So yeah, but we've gone back, and I have the Blu-ray box set of this amazing show. And
I saw some episodes not so long ago, and I like you, I thought this is not how I remembered it.
Yeah,
because I remembered it very much. This is what memory does, isn't it? This is what passage of time does to you. I remembered it being very much like those shows like Knight Rider and the A-Team and TJ Hooker, and it was quite different, quite different. much more, like I say, much more layered than I remembered it being. You know, and much grittier than I remember it being. For all the
quite
ocean,
dark in places. Yeah,
for all the ocean and the red Ferrari.
It's surprisingly dark in places, and I appreciate that. Even John Hillerman's character, who obviously was in Chinatown, for those who don't know, the character of Higgins, like he's a bit silly, and he's this sort of, I kind of like this. He's like this weird sort of golden age crime fiction clashing with tough guy American fiction, and I sort of like that combination. But even his backstory is quite interesting and layered as well. Like you sort of understand why he's so eccentric and why he's so prim and proper. I know there's a remake at the moment, and it just looks like dog shit,
as it so often does. That they've missed the whole point completely.
Yes,
you know that all these they seem to just become generic cop shows to me, American cop shows. So then they're nothing to do. It's just called Magnum. It's not actually Magnum. You know, it's not Thomas Magnum as he was. It just seems to be a generic cop show from what I've seen of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I used to quite like Higgins. And you're right. In different hands, he could have had a show of his own as a sort of Jessica Fletcher type.
Yeah.
You know, a golden age type
that.
rich bloke, you know. And it is him out of China. It is the waterboard man out of Chinatown. I'd forgotten.
Yeah,
forgotten that.
Well, Higgy Baby is as TC always calls him, Higgy Baby.
And it's another example of perfect casting. Yeah, I can't imagine anyone else but Tom Selleck doing that.
Thomas Magnum is one of my all-time favorites, and I think this is a show and a character that's worth revisiting and reevaluating, because, as you were saying, like you kind of clump him into that A-team kind of demographic.
You do, yeah.
He's better than
quite
that.
Different.
He's better. Yeah, he's better than that.
Yeah,
that's my number two. What's who do you got?
My number two was Morse.
Oh, I thought there was number one. Okay, cool. Right. So let's go with your number one.
Well, my number one. Who else could it be? My number one is Sherlock Holmes.
I figure you're going to go with Sherlock Holmes. It's Jeremy Brett, yeah?
I am going to say, in particular, Jeremy Brett, but in particular, even more, certainly the first 13 episodes, which I think are the pinnacle of Holmes on screen.
Yes.
And I would say up to The Sign of Four that they did in about 1987 to celebrate the centenary. After that, it's fair to say the quality dips because the money ran out. Brett's health doesn't help. It went on for at least one series too long. But even in those later ones, episodes like The Illustrious Client are really strong and could fit side by side with some of the earlier ones. But Holmes generally, I think after the Second World War, he was more at home on TV than he was in the cinema.
Yeah.
After a certain point, really after sort of the 60s, he becomes a parody in the cinema until he gets Murder by Decree. And after that, you get nothing until Robert Downey Jr., which we'll move on from. But in the TV, you have things like there was a it's lost now, but in the 50s there was a series with Alan Wheatley, who was the sheriff in Nottingham up against Richard Todd, was it? Playing Robin Hood? Richard Green. But that's lost. But then you get Douglas Wilmer in the 60s, who was absolutely fabulous. Then you get Peter Cushing taking over from Douglas Wilmer, who was also fabulous, but not quite as good as he was in the Hammer film. And then you get Brett, and so from the 60s to the 90s, Holmes was really great on TV. Each decade had one of its, had really good Holmes representation on TV. And for me, he's where it all started. It's where all this started. So I've got to have the old boy in there somewhere. But I think on TV, he's got a successful run. And he keeps being reinvented for TV, whether you like him or loathe him. He keeps being reinvented for TV, more so than he is in cinema. So I would suggest that Sherlock Holmes is obviously he's a printed character first off, but his next medium for me is the TV.
Yeah.
And I think he's more noir than people think. There are so many stories, and the crime fiction wasn't what it is today when Doyle was writing them. So they're a bit of everything. But when he's dark, stories like the 5 Orange Pits, that's really dark. That's really grim. The Valley of Fear, I think, is a private eye novel in all but name. Certainly the second half of it. And there are some really dark cases. The Dancing Men is really dark and tragic.
Yeah.
So I think there are flashes of noir in the Holmes stories that
definitely
deserve a bit more recognition than they do get, because sometimes you get these Agatha Christie weekends away, murder mystery weekends away, but they're always advertised with a picture of Holmes, and I think put Poirot on that, because that's much closer to the advert that you want to be making and showing. So yeah, I Holmes is my top TV detective, but in particular, it's early to mid Jeremy Brett.
I think that makes sense.
Closest to getting Doyle on film as you could get.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That's a good choice, and I totally get why you picked that. And I do agree that Holmes has lots of shades of noir. I wrote an essay about it. It's in a book somewhere. You can find it online. Because I literally talked all about it. Basically, the idea that you can look at the Sherlock Holmes stories and you can see the budding ingredients of hard-boiled fiction cooking in there.
You can, because there are very few whodunits in the Holmes stories.
Yes.
In a lot of them, the villain is from the start. It's how Holmes gets them. If anything, it's closest. Columbo is the closest. More than Poirot.
Yeah, but no, it's a good choice. Very, 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 very good choice. All Holmes. Holmes had to be mentioned. I did make sense. My number one is, we're going back to the 80s. I love me 80s.
I think I know you're going to say. Go on.
Spencer.
I knew it was going to be Spencer.
Spencer for Hire.
And I understand why.
This show is fantastic. This show ran for 3 seasons from 85 to 88. Then it was canceled. Then it was brought back for 4 TV movies. It had a fantastic cast. It had Robert Urich as Spencer, Avery Brooks, who was Benjamin Sisko on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and had Barbara Stock as the Susan Silverman character, who is Spencer's love interest, and based off the books by Robert B. Parker. I think a bit like Magnum. It's a really tough show. It's on, like, you look at it and think, okay, it's gonna be one of those like cheesy cop shows or whatever. It's thematically, it hits hard. I mean, they tackle racism, they tackle inner city struggles and corruption. There's like a really shocking episode about abortion. So like things that are happening at the time, like in the 80s, that are big topics, this show is handling them incredibly well. Like there's one episode where Susan, Spencer's girlfriend, is pregnant. And she's like, I'm working on a PhD. I have my whole career ahead of me. I'm not ready to have a kid yet. And Spencer, and the conflict is that Spencer wants her to keep the kid, and she's like, no, I don't want to. I've got my life ahead of me. I'm not ready. And that's the conflict. That's one of the big conflicts of the episode. And it's powerful stuff. And but it's very pro-choice, but it's also debating the choices. It's also debating what is happening socially at the time. And so I've always found this show to be very impressive in the way it addressed socio-political issues wrapped up in this, 1 hour long, PI romp. I just thought it's one of the best PI shows ever made.
Well, I mean, that's something that our friend Ian Rankin says, isn't it? That's what crime fiction can do. It can investigate the big themes while wrapping it up in a whodunit plot, or by which I mean a crime plot. And Spencer does that. I've seen a few episodes, but I think I watched it in the 80s. I think it used to be on quite late on a Friday night or something. After Cheers, when so like sort of 11 o'clock at night or something on ITV. And I remember watching some of those episodes and thinking, "Oh, this is good."
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because 3 seasons isn't a lot, and the show was actually a hit. They canceled the show kind of foolishly because there was a huge outcry. They were like, "Why did you cancel the show? Bring it back, bring it back!" But they waited so long that then all they could really muster was a couple of TV movies, and it's just a shame because but at the same time, it's a shame that it didn't continue. But what we do have are 3, what I would say, almost virtually perfect seasons. There's really not. I can only think of one episode that's a dud. There's one episode out of 3 seasons of like 26 episodes per season that I think is a dud.
That's not a bad
good.
batting average. Yeah, that's not a bad batting average.
No, it's amazing.
And it's, maybe it's true. You can have too much of a good thing. Maybe 3 seasons is, on the one hand, you've only got 3 seasons, but on the other hand, you've got 3 cracking seasons.
Exactly.
There's nothing there to spoil it. So going back to what I say about the Brett series, there are at least one series too many that make you think, oh, what a shame. And that will be the money men. I mean, Brett was way too ill to do it, but that'll be the money men just wanting to have more cash in the coffers. But there's something to be said for only having 3 seasons.
Yeah, because I would say the TV movies are and it's because they recast everyone except Spencer and Hawk. Robert Urich and Avery Brooks are the only ones who come back, and you feel it. Like you feel the loss. You're like, this. They also changed where they filmed. They didn't film in Boston any longer because it's set in Boston, and the original show was filmed there. They don't do it. They film in Canada, and you can feel the difference as well with that. You're sort of like,
you very often can, can't you? You very often can. So if a series of books is set in a particular city, I think if you're going to adapt them, you have to have that city. Oxford is a character in Moles. Yeah. Edinburgh is a character in Rebus. Boston is a character in Spencer. What's the point of shooting it in Canada?
It was cheaper. That's all.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So went for stand-in.
Why bother? Yeah.
But that for me is number one. I think this is a show that's hard to get a hold of. You might be able to find it online. There are some DVDs floating around. I wouldn't expect it. I think maybe in the States you can buy it on Amazon Prime Digital, I think, but in the UK you're sort of scrambling on eBay for DVDs that are going to come from the States. But it's worth getting a hold of. It's worth adding to the collection. There we are. There's our 5 favorite PI amateur sleuths detectives.
Yep. Good.
Should we run through one more time?
Yeah, do you want to run through as a summary?
So I chose Mulder and Scully, Endeavor, Dexter Morgan, Thomas Magnum, and Spencer.
I chose Dale Cooper, Sagan Aren, Adam Dalgleish, Endeavor Morse, and Sherlock Holmes.
There we go. Well, hopefully this gave you some new things to look up in the new year, eh?
And that brings us to the end of our New Year's special. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back next week with another case. In the meantime, please like and subscribe, and be sure to take care walking down those mean streets.